So let's talk about the fun stuff now. Your local CC&Rs, your covenants, conditions, and restrictions, your neighborhood rules and regulations. These are considered private land use controls. All those things we talked about before, for up until now, were all public land use controls, right? Your zoning department, your building codes, your health department, public. Now we're going to talk about your local, your rules and regulation. These are your privately imposed land use controls, all right? So the first thing we have to know about are deed restrictions. They're considered deed restrictions, right? If I say you can't park commercial vehicles in your driveway, or you can't leave your boat in your driveway, is that a restriction on what you're able to do with that property? Yeah, so those are a deed restriction, right? So this is imposed and enforced by individual property owners in your neighborhood, right? Deed restrictions or protected covenants. We call them protective covenants, all right, for a subdivision. Now, the rules for private subdivisions are only for your particular subdivision. It doesn't carry on to other subdivisions, all right? So it applies only to the subdivision identified, not to all the surrounding subdivisions. It is just yours, okay? Now, when you bought the house and you moved in, you were given a document to sign that said that you will abide by the rules and regulations of the community. And when you sell the house, the new owners are going to sign the same document. Because why? These rules are appurtenant. They run with the land, right? They run with the land, binding on all the subsequent owners, anybody and everything. So your developer has this idea that says, this is what I want in my master deed. And then he goes and he puts it into place. And then he says, if you want to buy in here, this is the rules you're going to have to follow. And then they're adapted after that, all right? Now, usually what the developer will say is, once we get a certain percentage of homeowners, 50%, 60%, 70% of homes and lots sold, I'll turn over the homeowners, association, the rules and regulation, I'll turn that over to the owners. And I'll work my way out of it, and they'll control themselves. All right. So usually there is a stipulation inside the master deed that says, once we have a certain level of ownership, I'll step out and we'll let the homeowners do it themselves. Have a HOA, right? A vice president, president, secretary, run their own thing. All right. And these covenants and restrictions can be for anything that's not illegal, anything. And as long as they have people that vote on it, they can put it into place. Okay. They can put it into place. It is not that god awful. Now, if you live in one of these communities, you always have the golf cart lady. Anybody familiar with what I'm talking about? The golf cart lady drives around the neighborhood to make sure that you don't have anything out of place. You don't have artificial flowers where there could only be natural flowers, or you don't have a commercial vehicle parked in your neighborhood. Please note, she don't have to be your neighbor. She does not have to be your neighbor. So they don't have to prove direct harm in order to bring you up on charges. She can live 2 miles down the road in the same development, has nothing to do with you, and yet write you up, right? Have the HOA write you up because you're against the rules and regulations, because they have nothing to do, right? But that's how they maintain these things. And some people are very happy to do so. So it doesn't have to be your neighbor turns you in. It could be somebody from 2 miles down the road, all right? So we have to be able, as brokers, we have to be able to know what these covenants and restrictions are. We're going to call them the CC&Rs, right? Conditions, covenants, and restrictions, okay? So we need to know, or at least review, what these land use controls are. Because if my client wants to bring 3 horses with him, or, we would know whether that yard was big enough. But let's say he's got 3 St. Bernards. Everybody knows what St. Bernard is, right? And in the covenants and restrictions says the maximum dog size is 50 pounds. Would he end up in trouble with the HOA if he moved in there with 3 St. Bernards? He very well could, right? He very well could. So we need to know that. And that is a material fact. Remember we said whatever was important to your client, right? So in that particular case, we would have to know that. So we'd have to review these things. Ask them questions, have them review a copy of it, right? Make sure that all of those things work. What if we live near the Roanoke River and we commercial fish? We're fishermen and we have boats. We have some fishing boats. We keep them on our property. What if your neighborhood says you can't put those boats on your property anymore? You're kind of out of luck, aren't you? You're going to have to find a spot. Maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you. So you need to know that before. Now, let me say this. If you got 3 horses and you buy this house and you were under the assumption that you could bring your horses and you signed all the docs and you moved in and you find out you can't bring horses, are you allowed to walk away? You own it. You own it. So that's why it's important, all right? Now, I'm sure that you as the broker, his broker, her broker, is going to hear about it. Yes? Or you think it'll be all pretty pleasant and they'll just say, yeah, never mind, I'll just get rid of the horses. I don't think so, right? They're going to come to you and say, why didn't you say something? Right? So you're the adult in the room, remember that, right? So you're going to be the person that's going to have to be, you have to protect your client. Because your client doesn't know anything about this stuff. You do, right? You're the trained person. All right. So you got to verify that their end use will be allowed, right? My dogs, what am I going to do with my dogs? I can't bring them in here, right? So now make sure that you don't make attorney type deals. You don't want to be interpreting contracts. You want to read them. If you have trouble understanding them, get an attorney to give you information. That's going to be real important, okay? Don't try to interpret these land use controls and things of that nature. If it doesn't make clear sense, don't guess. Get help, all right? Because it will matter. It will matter down the road, right? So we want to make sure that we are doing it correctly. Some red flags. We need to watch out for red flags. Red flags means that if something doesn't pass the sniff test, there's probably something wrong, right? The eye test here I'm talking about, something's not right. Trust your senses, right? So number 1 in our responsibilities as real estate brokers, avoid any representation about a property's zoning or permitted land uses without verifying the property's zoning. Check. Don't just say something can happen. That's not true, right? It's not the best information. And if appropriate, flood hazard area maps and any restricted covenants affecting the property. Give them the information. Document that you gave it to them. Okay? Document that you gave it to them. Understand what you're giving them. Discuss it. Right? So also drive around the community. If your guy has a commercial fisherman and you drive around the community and you haven't seen a boat in the yard, is it a question you might want to ask? If he's got 2 horses and you haven't seen a horse for miles, it's a question you want to ask, right? Something isn't right. Something doesn't fit the situation. Anything like that, right? Anything that doesn't seem right. Question, because it's going to be up to you to find these things out, right? You can't just, you're there not to shuffle paperwork. You're there to make the experience, right? You represent. And that's what we're going to get to in chapter 7, your representation. How do you act as somebody else, right? So these red flag situations are going to be incredibly important, all right? Walk the property. Look for wet spots. You can tell if a property floods. If you go out there and 3 days after it rains and everything's dry and then you walk down to the back and you still have water back there, got to ask the questions, right? Where's this water coming from? You on a lake? You on a river? You just flood here? What happens? Okay, those are things you got to look for. Okay, look at the FEMA maps. You can go to FEMA.gov and find out all of these things, where those flood zones are. And it could be running right through your house. Don't assume it has to be near the water. It does not. It's where the runoff goes. Right? It's where the runoff goes. Right? Also check with the zoning board, find out where those major roadways are going to go, right? Public transportation changes. If I'm buying a house in a nice little rural area with all kinds of trees in it, and then I realize that Interstate 74 is going through across my backyard, is that going to be a painful change for me? Yeah, that's going to be a painful change. I need to know that. That's a material fact, right? So I need to know that. What's going to happen, right? What's going to happen? If I buy a property that's up against I don't know, quarter mile of trees, and I think I'm going to live in the woods forever, and then about 3 months after I purchase it, all of a sudden I hear the bulldozers coming through and the trees snapping down, I'm going to be awful unhappy, right, with my agent. Why didn't she know that they were going to build right behind me? It happens. It happens. You need to kind of know everything. You need to kind of know everything. So be very aware. That's why you can't branch out too wide, because you can't possibly know everything unless you really, if you want to market that area, then you should know everything. But you got to be careful because you're going to have a lot of questions that need to be answered. Okay. All right. So let's finish up this chapter. The government regulates all of the following except what? Creation of subdivisions, building codes, subdivision regulations, restrictive covenants. Which one? The government regulates all the following except which one? There you go. The restrictive covenants are private, right? They're private to that community. So now when we say subdivision regulations, that means what kind of subdivision, how much can be built there, size-wise, things of that nature. But restrictive covenants is individual to the subdivision itself, all right? So again, this is private land use, okay? All right, so we talked about street disclosure laws, police power, by the enabling acts, right? The enabling acts let them do, give them police power. We talked about how to do a variance. What's a non-conforming use, both legal and illegal, right? We have a zone, we have a residential zone that has a Circle K that's been there for 100 years. We're going to let them stay, right? There'll be a legal non-conforming use versus an illegal non-conforming use. Okay, spot zoning was that little agricultural piece that we talked about, and then the Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's look at some questions just for a refresher. Steve converted his family's old estate home into a quadplex in 2010, even though the area has been zoned single-family residential prior to that time. If he sells the property, will the new owner be able to legally rent the 4 units individually? No, right? Because these things are appurtenant. They run with the land. It was illegal then, it'll be illegal going forward, right? It's illegal. True or false? The protective covenants of a neighborhood will override the less restrictive zoning laws. Always go with the stricter rules. The more restrictive rules are the ones that are going to apply, right? Regardless of who puts them out there, whatever the stricter rule is, that's what's going to apply. All right. And then the third one, true or false, the act of the government taking your land and building a new school is called eminent domain. The law is called eminent domain, I'll give you that, but that's not what the question asks. What's the act? The act is called condemnation, right? Kelly got it. Good job, Kelly. The act is called condemnation. So we're going to use the law of eminent domain to take private land for a public good. It has to be for a public good. And then but how we take it is going to be by condemnation. We're going to condemn the land. And we have to give just compensation. Okay, that's how the law is written, just compensation. All right. Now that we've talked about private ownership and public ownership and what we do to perk land and building permits and things of that nature, we have some natural things that are working against us too, right? We have some environmental issues, okay? Environmental issues. All right, so we have some environmental issues that we deal with all the time. Now, if you live near the water, you know you're going to have mold, right? That's just there. Asbestos, lead-based paint, right? Lead-based paint, radon. Now, a lot of folks from up north and mountainous areas in North Carolina will have a radon familiarity. On the when you're built on a slab and you have sandy soil under you and you don't really have a basement, not so much, but they'll be very familiar up north coming down. They'll want to know it. Formaldehyde, carbon monoxide, right, inside the houses. Electromagnetic fields. Do any of you live near high tension wires? If you do, if you go outside, just listen to what's you can hear the buzzing. You can hear the buzzing. So there is always electromagnetic fields going on. Groundwater contamination, right, from a underground storage tank, anything like that, you got to protect it. Remember we talked about that straight piping earlier, right? And waste disposal sites. Where are we putting our garbage? And where's that runoff going? Where's that runoff going? Now, there are very, very few dates. There are literally 5 dates you're going to have to remember in this whole class. 5. This is the first one. And then the last 4 come in fair housing, which is the last night. Okay? So, lead-based paint. This was a pigment that was in paint, in every kind of paint, prior to 1978. All right? So this was banned as of January 1, 1978. Could not use it anymore. But things were painted before then, right? So we could get lead poisoning from the chips that were in the paint, all right? In the dust, in the soil from the water, right? It was causing damage to the brain, nervous system, kidneys, red blood cells. But mostly it was hurting children, okay? Mostly it was hurting children. For any of you who have ever had a toddler, I'm sure there are some of us that are working with that right now. The toddlers, when they're teething, when they first get teeth, is there anything they will not put in their mouth? There is nothing they will not put in their mouth, try to chew on. Well, what was happening was cribs, windowsills, things of that nature that were painted prior to 1978 had lead-based paint in them. And these kids were getting sick. And they were getting getting lead poisoning from chewing on the, innocently, they're teething. You all know what that's all about, right? And they were getting sick, very sick. And it was from the lead that they were ingesting. So 1978 is the first date you have to remember. If that house was built prior to 1978, you have to disclose. There has to be a disclosure signed by both you and by the person who is selling it, and then by the buyer's agent and the buyer, that they know that this house was built before 1978, and they have the ability to inspect it if it thinks they're going to bother it. All right. So we have to disclose the presence of any known lead-based paint hazards. All right. Now we have to tell both buyers and renters. Buyers and renters. It's not just buyers. Okay. Buyers and renters, including the dust and the soil. It is both. All right. Now, so January 1, 1978, if this house was built before then, you need to do a disclosure. So that purchaser has a 10-day right of rescission on targeted properties, 1978. Okay. If you're going to do any renovations on an old house and strip things down to the bare wood, you have to have a qualified, certified inspector and vendor. Now, lead in and of itself, if you cover it with multiple coats of paint and you leave it encapsulated, that's what it's called, it's not going to bother anybody. It's when it's floating in the air, it's when it's ingested, it's when kids eat it that it becomes dangerous. So if you bought a house that was built in 1975 and that house hasn't been painted 3 or 4 times and you're at that level, well, that paint could still have lead in it. And you decide one day that you're going to strip that paint down to bare wood and you're going to repaint it. Well, that's where the problem comes in, all right? When you take that initial coat of paint. If you just paint over it, no issues, all right? It'll stay encapsulated, won't be a problem. It's when it gets in the air, it's when it gets ingested, that's a problem, all right? Now, fines for violations for not having a certified inspector or vendor. $750 a day. Pretty hardy fine, right? Pretty hardy fine. So we don't want to do that. Okay. Date number 1, 1978. Anything built before 1978, we need a lead-based paint disclosure. The second one we're going to talk about, is asbestos. Asbestos was used in shingles. Asbestos was used in insulation. Asbestos is still in play today. They're not using it anymore, but it's still out there. All right. So this was really good for fire resistance. It was good for insulation, for heat, wrapping pipes, under house pipes, things of that nature. All right. When it's intact, when it's not being bothered and it's wrapped, not a problem. The problem is when it starts falling apart and it starts getting all broken up, okay? Like anything else, it gets old, right? It becomes what's called friable. And I'm not talking spam fried, I'm talking about friable, F-R-I-A-B-L-E. If you've ever gone out and picked up, I know you all have, picked up a big clump of dirt and it was all hard, right? And then you just squoze it, right? And what happens to the dirt? It just kind of falls out, flaky, right? Just makes it sand again. That's called friability. So as long as we don't do that, as long as we don't get it in the air and it becomes these little particles, asbestos is okay. The best way we can use asbestos is to encapsulate it, put plastic around it, leave it, right? So that it doesn't come off. Now, I want you to think about, you've all seen television commercials about mesothelioma, right? You've heard about mesothelioma. This is from asbestos, okay? This is from asbestos. It was extremely dangerous for people who are plumbers, right? They're going to fix a pipe. It's leaking. They're pulling what? They're pulling it off, trying to get in there. All of that stuff gets up in the air. They're ingesting it. They're not wearing a mask back in 1976 or 77, are they? I doubt it. What about, remember we said it was good for heat and fire resistance? What if your house went on fire and that fireman comes up and starts breaking down your walls to contain the fire? What's he going to rip out? What kind of insulation? It's going to pull asbestos insulation out of the walls, and it's going to do what? It's going to pop up into the air, right? Breathe it in. Unless he's got a complete mask on, which more and more they do. But back in the early 80s, they didn't, right? They didn't do a lot of that stuff. So in this particular case, we got to make sure that they're protected, all right? And it was cancer. It was a carcinogen. It was getting stuck in their lungs. It wasn't dissolvent. It wasn't going anywhere, all right? So it occurs when it's disturbed or exposed, and when a lot of renovations, a lot of remodeling, okay? You can't, if you leave it be, it's fine. Much like this, there's a lot of houses that look just like this. You see that pipe underneath that house, right? In this particular case, it's a full basement. This is asbestos right here. And that's all up in the air. The best way to do that is to wrap that all up in plastic and leave it alone. leave it alone, all right? When we ask about abatement, the best way to get rid of the problem is to encapsulate it, wrap it in plastic. Don't remove it. What's going to happen if you remove it? Stuff's going to get in the air, right? You're going to be working against it. So the best thing you can do is get it real wet, super wet if you're going to take it off. All right. If it's going to come off of there, it's got to be heavily saturated. Do not do this yourselves. Have somebody who knows what they're doing do this. All right. If you've ever driven around by a house, an old house, and it looks like it's wrapped in white plastic, and you see guys in the white hazmat suits, usually it's an asbestos removal or an asbestos abatement. Okay. It's very, very dangerous. All right. So again, you want to seal it off so it never becomes airborne. When it becomes airborne is when the problem becomes. All right. That's when the problem becomes. All right. We want to wrap it in plastic, put it away, never touch it again. Leave it be. Leave it be. Wrap it up. It's not going to bother nobody. But if it becomes like this is a problem, right? All this stuff is in the air. And if you look back here, there's a gentleman back there. So that means that this room is fairly active. He's standing up. He's not on his knees. It's not like this is a crawl space. All right. So this is a basement or a workshop or something. Dangerous. Okay. So this has to be heavily saturated to remove it, but only by somebody who knows what they're doing. All right. Only by somebody who knows what they are doing. All right. So radon, lead-based paint, asbestos, radon. Radon is radioactivity. Now, the scary part. It's odorless, it's colorless, it's tasteless. You can't tell if it's there unless it's measured. Unless it's measured. And it comes naturally from the rocks, comes from the ground. So if you have a basement, if you have any kind of rocky soil, okay, it comes from the rocks. And it's a carcinogen, it's radioactive, right? It's radon. And it is in rock in every state. There's nothing you can do about it. But if you have it in your basement, you can put fans and ventilation in there and kind of blow it out and keep the fans and ventilation on it, and you can resolve the issue. All right, the fan in the attic. Now, it is measured in what's called a picocurie. A picocurie. Anybody remember Madame Curie? Science class, like 10th grade science class, right? Madame Curie was a two-time Nobel Award winner on studies of radioactivity, which ultimately, unfortunately, killed her sooner or later. She died from her work. But a picocurie is how it was named. Now, a picocurie is 1 part per trillion. 1 part per trillion. That is a very, very, very small particle. There's an analysis of something that I read once that says that if you want to know how small a picocurie is, it would be like if you're making a martini, 1 drop of vermouth in 5 carloads of gin. That's how small a picocurie is. Extremely tiny. All right. So again, you can set up ventilation. Now, if it is over 4 picocuries, it's a material fact. Okay. Over 4 picocuries is a material fact. All right. If it's 1 or 2 or 3, every property is probably going to have a little bit. If it is 4 or more, you need to let your client know that it is 4 or more. It is a material fact. And they can have it mitigated by putting ventilation systems in and things of that nature. There's a whole bunch of things they can do. And it gets less as you get higher in the building, but that still doesn't mean it's not there. It's got to go down. Okay. So if you have 1, 2, or 3 picocuries, it's not a material fact. If you have 4 or more picocuries, it is a material fact. Okay, if you have 4 parts per trillion, material fact. This is an option during my buying process. How do you know if this is the case and who is not requested? If it's not requested, you it's up to you to request it. You can buy these tests in Lowe's now. So it's up to the buyer. It should have been up to your agent if they had any suspicion of that. If you're from like if you're from New Jersey, New York, Ohio, where you have basements and things of that nature, more and more they're testing for radon, even when you go to sell it. So you know you're familiar with it when you come down here. All right. But yeah, it's going to be up to the agent to let people know. Some people don't have any idea what it is. But that's what the broker's there for, right? Protect them. Protect both your buyer and your seller. So yeah, but our clients from up in north, they know because they've been exposed to it, not exposed to radon, but exposed to the testing and whatnot. And usually what'll happen is somebody up there will test for it, and that's how they know. So yeah, you would definitely want to be the broker to tell somebody how, let's do a radon test. That would be nice, right? 4 picocuries means that it is a material fact, okay? 4 picocuries. You ever been to Lowe's? Yeah, I'm sure you've all been to Home Depot or Lowe's. And if you happen to walk down the lumber aisle, you'll see particle board, press board, even plywood to some extent. Well, that stuff is being held together, or it was at one time. They use a form of formaldehyde to hold it together. So in your walls and everything else, it has a certain level of formaldehyde because that's what they're putting the wood together with. They're pressing it, press board. It could be in some plywood, particle board, things of that nature, right? Some people are extremely sensitive to it, okay? Eyes, nose, throat, all right? Some suggest that it can cause cancer. I do not have that information that says it does, okay? There's some questions about it. However, we do need to know that that's an environmental concern, okay? If my whole attic is done with press board, is it going to be cost effective for me to take all of that stuff out? Probably not, right? So again, if we have the money, remove those sources if it's cost effective. If not, encapsulate it, cover it. Use HEPA air filters. HEPA air filters are good, right? Anything to get the air moving, all positive, all good stuff. Now, for you folks that are down by the water or anywhere that has humidity and water, you're going to have mold. Please understand, and everybody's kind of got this confused. If you find a spot of mold and you take Clorox bleach and you just wipe it away, you have not remediated the mold. You have cleaned up that area, but it is still there. It gets into the wall boards, it gets behind the walls, it gets into the vents, it gets everywhere, all right? So you need a pro to get this stuff out. If you have water and humidity, you are going to have mold. It's just the way nature works, right? Now, not all mold, there's all different types of mold. Not all of it is toxic, but I got to tell you that a lot of people have allergies to it, all right? So a lot of folks have mold allergies, and it affects them, right? So can make it difficult to obtain homeowners insurance. If it's a mess, if there's a problem and you can't get into to clean this up, and it doesn't take long to kill a whole room. Breathing issues, respiratory issues, right? Crawl spaces, any type of humid area. UV light, okay, UV light kills mold. Well, yeah, again, I'm not a professional remediator, so why not, right? I'd use anything. The thing is, you got to contain it to everything, though. You got to figure out where it is, and that's the hard part. It doesn't stay still, so yeah. But yeah, whatever you can get to remediate that stuff. But it's not just wiping the walls down. It's more than that, all right? So anytime there's water and humidity, you're going to get mold. A lot of us, before there was central air, central heat, right? Particularly central heat. There was a lot of oil heat in houses. There's still some. Didn't go completely away, but there's still some. And in order for us to have oil heat, what did we have to have? We'd have to have oil tanks, right? So we have millions, literally millions of these abandoned underground storage tanks, USTs, right? They left them there. They didn't fill them up. They just left them, okay? So if they had anything in them and they leaked, well, you don't think that an underground storage tank was going to be nice enough just to leave everything in the same spot, right? What happens when liquid of any type decides to leak out of something? It's going to find the path of least resistance, right? And it's going to go wherever it decides to go. And it could go, depending on how much fluid was in there, how much liquid was in there, it can go a long way. So remediation can be quite expensive, right? And you're going to have that thing taken out. If you look at this, right under that step, there is an underground storage tank there. And it belonged, let's say you bought that house. Let's say last week you bought that house. And all of a sudden you see that there's a cave in there and your back steps fell in. Is it your old, the old owner's responsibility or the new owner's responsibility to have that taken out of there? It is the new owner's responsibility. Take that out of there. So it is going to be that new owner is going to have to take that out. So these things get expensive. And if there's any ground contamination, they're going to start digging around. They're going to test the dirt. They're going to test the ground, right? So we want to make sure we test for these things. We want to make sure we test for these things. Now, as a broker, if you know of these, you have to disclose it. If you know that somebody's got an underground storage tank, you have to disclose it to all purchasers and tenants. All right? In the event that something happens, a collapse, a leak, whatever. Okay. So yeah, you should get an inspection. Hire somebody to go inspect for those, because this gets, if that CERCLA and Superfund Act. CERCLA is the government act that provides cleanup for these catastrophes. They are. All right. And CERCLA stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. You won't have to remember that, just CERCLA. This is the Superfund Act. All right. And basically what this says is that this is where they can go to the owners of these businesses that they find environmentally damaging. And the current owners are going to be the first people they go to. And if they can't get it by the first people, they're going to go to the past owners. And if they can't find the past owners and they have everything in place, what they're going to do is they're going to go to the Superfund and pay for it. Okay? They're going to go to the Superfund and pay for it. But these things can cost millions of dollars and take years to get fixed, because they have to keep going, right? If you have a big tank, or God forbid you were dumping into the river. You ever want to look something up? Look up Love Canal in New York State. Some of you might be familiar. Love Canal, all of these chemical companies were dumping into the canal. They're still cleaning it up. That was 1980, right? This is 40 some years after, and they're still trying to clean it up. So that's a big problem. It's a big issue, all right? So CERCLA is the fund and the government agency that says, we're going to clean this up and this is how we're going to get it paid, right? So that's how we're going to do that. All right, let's finish this up. True or false? Sellers, listing brokers are responsible for guaranteeing that no lead-based paint hazard exists in properties built prior to 1978. Right? Yeah, only known hazards, right? Only known hazards. If I bought this house in 2015, I don't know. Now, I got to be honest with you. Because of what I know, I'm going to assume that there was, but it's 2015. I didn't put it in there. I don't know if they used it or not. My assumption is going to be there is. I'm going to assume that there should be levels of paint here, right? So I have to be smart, right? I have to be smart. If I need the inspections, I'm going to get it. If I'm going to be the seller, I'm not going to strip it down to bare wood, okay? But again, this is only disclosing any known hazards. So I have to do the disclosure. True or false, having a qualified remediator carefully remove all asbestos from a property is the preferred method of abatement. No, we want it encapsulated. We do not want to start ripping that stuff off, right? You start ripping it off, what happens? Yeah, you want containment, exactly right. You want to put a plastic sleeve around it, wrap it in plastic, whatever it is, contain it, leave it. If you start tearing it off or putting it in trash or doing whatever, it has to be super heavy saturated in order for it not to get friable and blow up into the air. All right, you cannot let that happen. So safer to encapsulate it and leave it be than it is to let it blow through the air. All right. True or false, the presence of radon gas in any residence is a material fact that must be disclosed to all interested parties. Yeah, right. It has to be what? 4 picocuries or higher. If it's 4 picocuries or higher, then it is actionable. It's a material fact. Unless it is, it's not. 1, 2, or 3, it's not a material fact. Don't have to disclose that.
If you like this video, feel free to share it with a friend. For more real estate education content, please subscribe to the channel. From all of us at Seacoast Real Estate Academy, thank you for watching.